Picture this. You get your paycheck, and before you do anything else, before you pay a bill, before you buy groceries, before you even think about the weekend, you move 10% straight into savings. Every single time, no exceptions. That's discipline. That's responsibility. That's exactly what every personal finance book, every financial advisor, every well-meaning parent has told you to do your entire life. Save 10%. You'll be fine. So here's what I need to tell you, and I need you to actually hear this. If you're earning $80,000 a year and you've been faithfully saving that 10% for the last decade, you are currently on track to retire with less than half of what you're going to need. Not 90%, not 80%, less than half. And the most dangerous part? You have no idea, because the rule told you were doing it right. I'm Cole, and on this channel, we run the actual numbers, the ones nobody puts in the motivational poster. Today, we're going to break down exactly where the 10% rule came from, why it was never designed to actually get you to retirement, and what savings rate the math actually demands if you want to stop working on your own terms. If that's what you're here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell. New video every week. Let's get into it. The 10% savings rule didn't come from a retirement study. It didn't come from an actuary running longevity projections. It didn't come from anyone who sat down and said, okay, given inflation, given healthcare costs, given how long people actually live now, what does a household actually need to save? It came from a book published in 1926, The Richest Man in Babylon, George Clausen, a collection of parables set in ancient Mesopotamia. The core lesson? Pay yourself first. Keep 1 coin in 10 for yourself before you spend anything else. Now, that's actually a solid behavioral principle. Pay yourself first, automate your savings, don't let lifestyle consume everything you earn. That part holds up. But here's what happened. That behavioral rule got quietly converted into a retirement target. And then it got repeated so many times by so many people in so many different books and articles and financial planning brochures that everyone just assumed someone must have done the math at some point. They didn't. Or rather, when people did eventually run the numbers, the answer that came back was uncomfortable. So the rule stayed simple. 10% is easy to remember. It's easy to follow, and it makes you feel like you're doing something real, which is exactly why it kept getting passed down. Here's the problem. The financial world in 1926 looked nothing like the one you're trying to retire in. Life expectancy in the United States in the 1920s was under 60 years old. You weren't planning for a 25-year retirement. You were planning to work until you physically couldn't, then die shortly after. There was no 401k. There was no IRA. Social Security didn't exist yet. The entire concept of a self-funded, multi-decade retirement is a modern invention, and we've been trying to solve a modern problem with a century-old rule of thumb that was never designed for it. And here's what makes it worse. The cost of retirement has exploded in ways nobody in 1926 could have predicted. Healthcare alone has changed the math completely. The average retired couple today will spend over $300,000 on healthcare costs out of pocket during retirement, and that number is rising every year. That's a line item that didn't meaningfully exist in the original rules world. Neither did 30-year mortgages stretching into retirement years, or adult children needing financial support longer, or the death of pension plans that used to provide guaranteed income on top of personal savings.
The 10% rule was designed for a world where you worked, you died, and the gap between those two events was short. It was never designed for a world where you might spend 30 years in retirement, managing inflation, healthcare costs, sequence of returns risk, and a social security system under structural pressure. This is advice built for a different world, being applied to yours, and the gap between those two worlds is costing you hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Let's actually run the numbers, because this is where the 10% rule falls apart completely. Not in theory, not in philosophy, but in hard arithmetic. Let's use a real scenario. You're 30 years old. You earn $80,000 a year. You've bought into the 10% rule, so you're saving $8,000 annually. You invest it, You get a reasonable average annual return of 7%, which is a standard long-term market assumption after inflation. And you do this consistently for 35 years, retiring at 65. Here's what that produces. After 35 years of disciplined, consistent 10% savings invested at 7% annually, you retire with approximately $1,087,000. Sounds like a lot. Sounds like you made it. Over $1 million. Now let's figure out what that actually buys you in retirement. Financial planners use something called the 4% rule. The idea that you can withdraw 4% of your retirement portfolio annually without running out of money over a 30-year retirement. It's not perfect, but it's the standard benchmark. 4% of $1,087,000 is $43,480 per year. That's your retirement income. $43,480 a year, or about $3,600 a month. Now here's the part that stings. You were living on $80,000 a year before retirement. Most retirement planners say you need somewhere between 70% and 90% of your pre-retirement income to maintain your lifestyle, because some costs go down, but others, specifically healthcare, go dramatically up as you age. Let's be generous and use 75%. That means you need $60,000 a year in retirement. You have $43,480. That's a $16,520 annual shortfall every single year.
Now let's run the same scenario at a higher income, because I know some of you watching this are earning more than $80,000, and assuming the math gets better as the salary goes up. You're earning $120,000 a year, 10% savings rate, $12,000 annually invested at 7% for 35 years. You retire with approximately $1,630,000. The 4% rule gives you $65,208 per year in retirement income. But at $120,000 pre-retirement income, your 75% target is $90,000 per year. You're still short by $24,800 annually. Your income went up 50%. Your retirement shortfall got worse in absolute dollars. This is the cruel math of the 10% rule. It doesn't scale with your income. It scales with your lifestyle. And the more you earn, the more your lifestyle expands. And the wider the gap becomes between what 10% produces and what you actually need. And before you say, okay, but what about Social Security? The average Social Security benefit right now is roughly $1,900 a month, so about $22,800 a year. That closes the gap on paper. You're at $66,280 combined for the 80K earner. You're fine, right? Except Social Security was never designed to be your primary retirement income. It was designed as a supplement. And if you're planning your entire retirement on the assumption that Social Security will pay out at current rates for the next 30 to 35 years, you are making a significant bet on a system that is currently projected to face funding shortfalls within the next decade. But even setting Social Security aside entirely, here's the real problem with that $1.87 million number. We calculated it in today's dollars, but you're not spending today's dollars in retirement. You're spending the dollars of 2055 or 2060. And at a 3% average annual inflation rate, which is actually below the historical average, that $1.87 million has the purchasing power of roughly $437,000 in today's money. The number on the screen looks like $1 million. The lifestyle it buys feels like $400,000. That's what 10% actually builds. That's the math they're not putting in the poster.
Now, at this point, someone in the comments is going to say, Cole, you just need to start earlier. If you start at 22 instead of 30, the compound interest takes care of everything. I hear this constantly, and I want to address it directly because it's one of the most seductive half-truths in personal finance. Yes, starting earlier helps. Compounding is real and it's powerful. But starting earlier does not fix a broken savings rate. It amplifies whatever rate you're running. If your rate is wrong, you're just wrong for longer. Let me show you exactly what I mean with Jake and Carol. Jake and Carol are both 25 years old. Same job, same $75,000 salary.
Jake reads the classic advice. He saves 10%, $7,500 a year, starting immediately, invests everything at 7% average annual return, retires at 65. Carol reads something different. She saves 20%, $15,000 a year, but she doesn't start until she's 30, 5 years later than Jake. Same 7% return, same retirement age. Who comes out ahead? Jake, 40 years of saving at 10%, retires with approximately $1,587,000. Carol, 35 years of saving at 20%, retires with approximately $2,175,000. Carol starts 5 years later. She saves twice as aggressively, and she ends up with $588,000 more than Jake at retirement, nearly 37% more wealth despite getting a later start. The savings rate mattered more than the head start. Now, let's take it one step further. What if Carol had saved 20% and started at 25, same as Jake? $3,174,000.
That's the number. More than double Jake's outcome. Same income, same market returns, same timeline. The only variable is the savings rate. And now let's add a third scenario, because I want you to see the full picture of what aggressive savings actually produces over time. Same Jake, but now imagine at age 35, after 10 years of 10% savings, he has a wake-up call. He reads the math, he's uncomfortable, and he decides to push his savings rate to 25% for the remaining 30 years of his career. His first 10 years at 10% produced approximately $104,000 in accumulated savings. That balance continues to compound, and now he layers 25%, $18,750 annually on top of it for the next 30 years. Jake's corrected retirement balance? Approximately $2,640,000. He lost 10 years running the wrong rate. He course-corrected at 35, and he still ends up $1,053,000 ahead of where the 10% rule alone would have taken him. This is the most important thing I want you to take from this section. It is never too late to correct the rate. The math does not punish you permanently for starting wrong. It rewards you immediately for starting right, even if right is 15 years later than it should have been.
So if 10% is wrong, what's right? The honest answer is it depends on when you're starting and what you're trying to build. But here's the framework the math actually supports, broken down by decade. In your 20s, your floor is 15%. Not your goal, your floor. If you were in your 20s earning any kind of income and you were saving less than 15%, you are already behind on a schedule you haven't started yet. Ideally, you're pushing toward 20% before your income starts climbing, because once lifestyle inflation kicks in, raising your savings rate gets structurally harder every year you wait. If you hit 20% in your 20s and hold it, you are buying yourself an enormous amount of optionality later. You're not just building a retirement fund, you're building the option to retire early, or take career risks, or weather a layoff without panic. 20% in your 20s is the difference between financial flexibility and financial fragility at 45. In your 30s, and this is where most of the people watching this video actually live, if you've been running 10% up to this point, your target is 20 to 25%. I know that number feels aggressive. I know there are mortgages and childcare and student loans and all of the reasons that 25% sounds impossible right now. But here's how I want you to think about it. You're not trying to save 25% of your income forever starting tomorrow. You're trying to close a gap that the 10% rule created. That means every raise, every bonus, every expense that drops off, it goes to savings first. Not lifestyle, not a nicer car. Savings. You are in catch-up mode, and the faster you acknowledge that, the less extreme the catch-up needs to be. In your 40s, and this is where I'm going to be completely honest with you, because nobody else will be, the target range is 25% to 30%. Yes, that's a real number. Yes, it requires real trade-offs. At 40, you have roughly 25 years of compounding runway left. That's still meaningful, but the math is less forgiving than it was at 30. Every year you spend at 10% in your 40s is a year you cannot recover with any savings rate later. The runway is shortening,
and the gap is widening simultaneously. If you're in your 40s and behind, the conversation you need to have is not how do I optimize my investment portfolio? It's what expenses can I eliminate or reduce that free up 5 to 10 additional percentage points of my income for savings. That's the lever that actually moves the needle at this stage. Here's the reframe that actually helps people make this shift mentally. You're not saving more to deprive yourself. You're compressing your dependency on a paycheck. Every additional percentage point you save isn't money you're losing. It's time you're buying. Time where you don't have to show up for someone else's schedule because your portfolio is producing your income instead.
The goal isn't to save as much as possible. The goal is to hit the number that makes work optional as early as possible. And 10% doesn't get you there. The math just doesn't close. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the math is this clear, if you can run these numbers on a basic calculator and see that 10% is catastrophically insufficient for most people, why does everyone keep recommending it? Part of it is inertia. The rule is 100 years old. It's in every book. It's been repeated by every financial commentator. Challenging it requires effort and creates friction, and most advice is optimized to be easy to give, not necessarily effective to follow. But there's a more uncomfortable reason. The financial services industry broadly benefits from the 10% rule, not because they're deliberately deceiving you. Most financial advisors genuinely believe what they're telling you. But the structure of the industry creates a soft incentive to keep the number approachable. If the real answer is you need to save 20 to 25%, a significant portion of the population is going to respond by saying, I can't do that right now, and disengaging entirely. And a disengaged customer doesn't open accounts, doesn't pay advisory fees, doesn't roll over their 401ks. 10% is the number that keeps people in the system without overwhelming them. It's the number that feels achievable, and achievable sells.
This isn't a conspiracy. It's just the natural result of advice being filtered through an industry that profits from accessibility, not outcomes. The rule that benefits institutions and the rule that builds your actual wealth are not the same rule. And nobody in a position to sell you something has a strong incentive to make that distinction loudly. This is the part of the system that was never explained to you, and it's the part that matters most. So here's where we land. The 10% rule is not evil. It's not a scam. It's a behavioral anchor that got mistaken for a retirement formula. And that mistake is going to cost an entire generation of disciplined, hardworking savers hundreds of thousands of dollars if they don't catch it in time. The good news is the math works in your favor the moment you correct it. If you're currently saving 10%, your immediate move is to calculate what 15% looks like, not as a permanent commitment, as a next step. Most people earning $80,000 or more can find 5% additional savings through a combination of reduced lifestyle inflation and redirected raises. You're not trying to overhaul your entire life. You're trying to close a gap that the rule created. Then you run the number on 20%, not as a punishment, but as a target. Put it into a compound interest calculator. See what your retirement portfolio looks like at 20% versus 10%. See the actual dollar difference that one decision produces over 20 or 30 years. Because once you see that number, you can't unsee it. And here's the thing I want you to actually take away from this video, because this is the part that matters more than any specific percentage. You are not bad at money. You're not behind because you made bad choices. You're behind, if you are behind, because you were handed a broken rule and told it was wisdom. You followed the advice. The advice was wrong. That's not a character flaw. That's a curriculum failure. The path forward isn't shame. It's math. It's adjusting the number, running the calculation, and making one decision differently than you made it before. That's it. If this video changed how you're thinking about your savings rate, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what you're currently saving and what your target is going to be. I read every single one. And if you know someone who's proud of their 10% savings habit, someone who thinks they've got it figured out, send this video to them. Because the best thing you can do for someone you care about is hand them the actual math. Subscribe if you haven't. New video every week. I'll see you in the next one.